The woman they sent to die on the island had been there so long she'd started dreaming in tides. Mara didn't tell anyone that. Didn't tell the supply drones when they dropped ration packs at the edge of the tree line. Didn't tell command when they pinged her weekly check-in and asked the standard questions. Perimeter status, anomaly count, psychological stability index. She answered everything in the acceptable range and went back to watching the water. The island had no official name. The Galveth survey teams had tagged it Coastal Observation Post 7, but in the old maps, the ones Mara had printed out and laminated before the networks went down, it was called Palau Penyu Batu, Island of the Stone Turtle. She'd found the folklore in a linguistic archive, an annotation buried in a metadata field. An ordinary male turtle, separated from his mate in a storm, found a sacred pool and ate from it despite a warning, and turned to stone on the shore. The archive noted there were multiple versions of the story, and that in most of them, the outcome was the same. She thought about that a lot. The versions where the ending didn't change. The Galveth had come 17 months ago. They hadn't come like the stories said. Invaders came. No armadas blotting out the sun. No ultimatums broadcast on every frequency. They'd arrived the way a tide comes in. So gradually that you only noticed when the water was already at your chest. First, the satellite outages. Then the animals going strange. Birds flying in patterns that weren't migratory. Nothing that made sense, and the sea turtles that nested on this coast, suddenly appearing in numbers that the researchers called miraculous, and Mara had immediately called wrong. Then the Galveth themselves, walking out of the water one morning like they'd always been there. 7 feet tall and iridescent, in the early light, carrying instruments that hummed at frequencies that made your back teeth ache. They said they had come to study. They said this in every human language, simultaneously, the words coming from a membrane in their thorax that vibrated like a struck bell. They said the word study the way an anthropologist says it, clinically. A little bored, as if the subject is interesting mostly for what it represents rather than what it is. Maras had been stationed on the island 6 weeks before they arrived. She'd come to monitor nesting populations. That was the cover story, and also the truth, because command had wanted eyes on the coast, without the Galveth noticing a military installation. Mara was a biologist first, a soldier second. The island had seemed like the kind of posting where neither skill would matter much. By month 3, she understood it was the only posting that mattered at all. The Galveth set up their own station 4 kilometers on the other arm of the bay. They did not ask permission. They did not acknowledge Mara's station at all. This was, she'd learned, not rudeness. It was their version of courtesy. Acknowledging her would have implied she was relevant to their study. Ignoring her meant they considered her part of the background, part of the data set. She had spent 13 months becoming invisible to them on purpose, and in doing so, had become the only human being on Earth who knew what they were actually doing. Nika found the dead turtle on a Thursday. The child had arrived on the island 8 months ago, which Mara still couldn't entirely account for. One of the fishing families that worked the outer reefs had asked. Through the complicated sign language and pidgin Malay, they developed over weeks of tentative exchange, if their youngest could stay on the island while the rest of the family made the long crossing to the mainland. It was supposed to be 2 weeks. The family hadn't come back. Mara didn't know why, and she tried not to imagine the specifics. Nika was 10 years old and spoke very little and moved through the island like she'd been born on it. Slipping in the Hasuarina trees in the early morning, crouching at the water's edge in a way that the Galveth monitors. With their horizontal visual range and their sensitivity to vertical motion, simply could not track. She brought Mara things, feathers, interesting stones, once a whole coconut crab that she'd somehow caught bare-handed, the way a small animal brings offerings to mark territory as shared. The dead turtle was a leatherback, enormous, almost 2 meters, from nose to tail. It lay at the edge of the tide line with its flippers extended, not struggling, not gasping, just still, in the particular way that things are still when the process is already finished. Its shell was unmarked, its eyes were open. Around it in the sand, Mara counted 11 other leatherbacks, equally still, equally unmarked, arranged in a rough circle as if they'd gathered deliberately, and then simply decided to stop. Nika stood at the edge of the circle and did not go in. She looked at Mara with the flat, assessing gaze that Mara had come to understand was not absence of emotion, but the opposite. It was the face the child made when she was containing something too large to show. Mara crouched at the edge of the nearest turtle and looked, without touching. The sand inside the circle was disturbed in a specific pattern she recognized. The same faint radial scoring she'd seen 3 weeks ago, around the base of 2 casuarina trees that had simply stopped photosynthesizing, their leaves still green, their trunks still upright, their cellular chemistry intact and completely arrested. The Galvith called the instrument that made this pattern a coherence anchor. She'd found the term in a fragment of their transmitted data that she'd intercepted and spent 6 weeks translating, a sentence at a time, using the linguistic framework she'd been building since month 2. A coherence anchor did not kill exactly. It synchronized. It brought everything within its radius into a single temporal moment, a single point of stillness, and held it there. Held the turtles in a circle of frozen present. Held, if the range was extended, anything within 4 kilometers. She stood up and looked north, toward the Galvith station. "Nika," she said, "go to the bunker. Take the emergency bag. Don't come out until I come for you." Nika looked at the turtles for another long moment. Then she turned and walked into the trees without a word. And Mara watched her go, and felt the specific fear that comes not from danger approaching but from having understood. Too late that the danger was never approaching. It had always been here, waiting patiently, doing its work. First time the day reset, Mara thought she was losing her mind. She was at her monitoring station, running the morning's atmospheric readings, when the light changed. Dimmed, changed, in quality, the way it changes at a specific angle of the sun, a specific time. She looked at her instruments. They showed 0612. She had just looked at them, and they had shown 0847. She looked at her notes. The page she'd been writing on was blank. Her coffee was hot. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and began writing, faster than she'd written anything since her doctorate, filling the page with the previous 3 hours of observations, every detail she could hold, treating her own memory like evidence that could be contaminated by time. It happened again 4 days later, and again 11 days after that. Each time she lost between 2 and 5 hours. Each time she woke. That was the only word for it. Woke. With the previous version of the morning intact in her memory, layered over the new version like a double exposure. She cross-referenced the reset times with the positions of the Galvith station's energy outputs and found the pattern on her 3rd attempt. The resets correlated precisely with extended coherence anchor activation. The Galvith were not just freezing points in space. They were in what she could only describe as a research methodology, resetting local time to observe differences in outcome, running the same conditions again and again, adjusting variables, watching what changed. They were not studying the island. They were studying her. The realization arrived with a strange calm, like stepping into very cold water. The initial shock giving way to a clarity that was almost physical. She had felt this once before, kneeling over a specimen that turned out to be a new species, the world reorganizing itself around a single fact. The Galvith had been aware of her from the beginning. The studied indifference, the careful staging of their instruments beyond the range of her sensors. It was not oversight. It was control. She was the data set. She was the variable being adjusted. They wanted to know what a human being would do when she understood what was happening. She understood what was happening. Now she needed to decide what to do. The folklore about the stone turtle had 3 versions. In the first version, the turtle ate from the sacred pool, turned to stone, and that was the end. Lesson: disobey a warning and suffer the consequence. In the second version, the turtle's mate, searching for him, found his stone form on the shore and wept, and her tears fell on the stone, and the turtle woke and found his way home. Lesson: love is a form of temporal reversal. Grief can undo transformation. In the third version, the one the archive had flagged as variant, possibly apocryphal. The turtle found the sacred pool, understood what eating from it would mean, and did not eat. Instead, he waited at the edge of the pool until the creature that guarded it came out to see why he wasn't eating, and then he ate the guardian instead. Lesson: warnings are not about what you'll suffer. They're about what you're supposed to be afraid of long enough for something else to take you. Mara had read that third version at U200 on a sleepless night 6 months ago and had written a single word in her margin notation. Finally, she had been building toward it ever since. Galvith, researcher, came to her station on a morning in the 14th month that she recognized. From the tidal data and the angle of light as a reset point, she had been expecting it. She'd been working toward being expected. It stood in the tree line for 11 minutes. She'd learned that was their observation window before first contact, a behavioral threshold she'd confirmed through 7 previous encounters. And then it walked into the clearing. It was taller than the others she'd seen, with the particular iridescence of the longer cast researchers, blue-green in the morning light like the underside of a wave, its thorax instruments visible as a faint constellation of lights beneath its carapace. It spoke in the harmonic register she'd come to think of as polite mode, formal, slightly distanced, the Galvith equivalent of addressing a colleague you don't particularly know. You have become aware of the observation protocol, it said. She'd prepared for this. She'd prepared for a lot of versions of this. Yes, she said. You understand that your awareness has introduced a variable that complicates the data set. I understand that you think that. A pause. The thorax lights shifted. She'd learned that this was the Galvith version of a frown, a recalibration flicker, the expression of a mind updating its model. You have a different interpretation. I have a different interpretation, she agreed. She poured coffee from the flask and set a second cup on the table. She'd done this, knowing they didn't drink liquids in the human sense, knowing the gesture would register as data. She watched the researcher's carapace tilt. A slight deflection, less than 5 degrees, that corresponded, she'd calculated, to the processing of an unexpected input. You want to tell me, the Galvith said, that your awareness is itself a data point. I want to tell you that I've been running my own study, Mara said, 11 months. And I have more data on Galvith observation methodology than any human alive. Another pause. Longer. The thorax lights dimmed very slightly, which she'd never seen before. She filed it. You have been preparing for this conversation, the researcher said. I've been preparing for the one after this one, she said. This one is just context. The researcher was still for a long time. Outside, a bird called once. A Brahmini kite, she knew it by the pitch, and the sound moved off across the water and left a silence that felt significant, like the first note of something. What do you want? The Galvith asked, finally, in the register she'd categorized as direct mode, used only when the social scaffolding had been cleared away. It was the closest thing to honesty the language had. Mara looked at the researcher for a moment. Through the tree line she could see the water, and in the water the slow, dark shapes of turtles moving. The big leatherbacks, 8 of them in the shallows, where they nested every year. Where they'd nested every year for 40,000 years. She'd read once, before the continents looked like this, before language, before anything that called itself civilized. I want the timeline intact, she said. I want the reset stopped. I want my people back. She said my people, knowing it was a provocation, knowing the Galvith would classify it as territorial assertion and run a priority calculation on whether territorial assertion from a research subject warranted military escalation. She'd run that calculation herself 17 times, using every behavioral model she'd built, and the answer came out the same every time. No, Tude. Not because humans weren't worth escalating against, but because the Galvith wanted the subject functional. A territorial assertion from the study population was information. Killing the population was not. She was betting her life on 17 months of behavioral modeling. She was betting on the third version of the story. The resets serve the integrity of the research, the Galvith said. The resets serve the assumption that you're running the study, Mara said. I'm running the study now. You're the variable. The thorax lights went completely dark for 3 full seconds. When they came back, they were a different color. She'd never seen it before. She didn't have a category for it. She pulled out her notebook and wrote down the exact wavelength as best she could estimate it. Because that was what you did. You kept writing, kept recording, kept making sense out of what you were looking at, even when it scared you badly enough that your hands weren't entirely steady. So you are a single individual, the researcher said. Finally, in a register she'd never heard, something between direct mode and what she'd tentatively categorized as peer mode, used only between members of the same research cast. Cannot run a study with a sample of one. I know, Mara said. That's why I need you to go home and tell them what happened here. What had happened here was this. She'd laid it out in a document she'd been drafting for 9 months, updating it after every reset, every observation, every conversation with Nika, that had quietly confirmed the things she was half sure she knew. She'd called it a research report, formatted it in the Galvith data presentation structure she'd reverse-engineered from the transmission fragments, titled it in their categorical notation system. She'd printed 3 copies, which was more than she needed, but she'd learned from 11 months of preparedness that redundancy was the most honest expression of optimism. She slid the first copy across the table. The researcher looked at it without touching it. Or rather, without activating the bioluminescent contact sensors on its manipulators, which was the Galvith equivalent of not touching something. It was reading the surface data, the structural markers. It was assessing. This is an analysis of our methodology, it said. It's an analysis of your errors, Mara said. Specifically, the 17 points at which your observation protocol assumes that the subject, me, will behave like a component in a closed system. None of us do. That's not stubbornness. That's biology. We have this specific adaptation where we notice when we're being observed and we change. You've been running the same study for 14 months and wondering why the results keep shifting. It's because you keep resetting to a condition that no longer exists. We reset to correct for accumulated variables. You reset to eliminate the data that frightens you, Mara said, and kept her voice level, kept it like the surface of deep water. Nothing showing, nothing disturbed. The data that shows the subject is adapting faster than the study design accounts for. Keep resetting to the morning where I didn't know yet. But I know. Every time you reset, I know again. You can't unlearn someone. You can only waste time pretending you can. A long silence. The tide was coming in. She could hear it at the edge of the trees, the soft, constant argument of water against sand. The coherence anchor, the researcher said, slowly, operates on local temporal matrices. Your memory should not persist across resets. I know, Mara said. I don't know why it does. Been trying to figure it out for 7 months. She paused. I think it might be the turtles. The thorax lights shifted again. Not the recalibration, flicker. Something else. Something she'd only seen once before. In the moment before the researcher had first entered the clearing. She'd tentatively labeled it anticipatory recalibration, but she was increasingly thinking the better word was wonder. Turtles, the researcher said. Leatherbacks navigate by magnetic field. They use the Earth's electromagnetic signature as a temporal anchor. They find the same beach, the same coordinates, every nesting season. They're not using memory the way we use it. They're using something more like position, like knowing where you are so completely that time is just the distance between one point and the same point. She stopped, picked up her coffee, put it down without drinking. I've been sleeping near the nesting sites. I started doing it in month 2 because it was warm and the sand was good and I wasn't sleeping well. I don't know if it matters. My memory persists across the resets. And the turtles are the only variable I can't control for. Another long silence. The researcher had not moved. The Galvith could hold a position with a stillness that nothing biological on Earth could match. A muscle ontolog system that could sustain complete stasis for hours. She'd learned to read the small signs. The slow cycling of the respiratory membrane. The micro-adjustments of the carapace against the joints of the limbs. It was thinking hard. Your report, it said finally. You want us to take it back. I want you to take it back and give it to whoever writes the grant applications, Mara said. I want the people who decided to study us to read an analysis of their own study written by the subject. I want them to understand that this is what happens when you try to run a closed study on an open system. She looked at the researcher. We're not turtles in a circle. We're not variables you can freeze. Every time you try to hold us still, we find the shore again. The researcher picked up the document. It did this with great deliberateness, activating its contact sensors, which, in the Galvith behavioral lexicon she'd been building, was an act of formal receipt. The gesture that indicated a thing was now considered evidence. There will be a review, it said. I know, she said. The review process takes 8 of your months. The timeline will remain disrupted until the review is complete. I know that too, she said. I've stalked for 12. The researcher was still for another moment. Then it made a sound she'd never heard from a Galvith. Not language, not data transfer, not the subaudible resonance of instrument calibration. A sound like a bell, struck once, clean and deliberate, fading slowly into the frequency of the water. She didn't have a category for it. She wrote it down anyway. Nika came out of the bunker at sunset, when the light was doing the thing it did at this particular latitude, at this particular time of year. Going amber, and then gold, and then something that didn't have a name, a color that was really a quality, the quality of the world, insisting on its own beauty, despite everything. The child stood at the edge of the beach and watched the last light on the water. The leatherbacks were moving in the shallows. 6 of them, 8. The slow gravitational circuit of ancient creatures that had done this so many times, that time itself bent around them, that had survived impacts and extinctions, and the remapping of continents, and now these new visitors with their coherence anchors and their research protocols, and they kept going, kept finding the shore. Nika turned and looked at Mara with that flat, assessing gaze. Are they leaving? She asked. She meant the Galvith. Mara knew from the specific direction of her eyes, the north tilt of her chin. Eventually, Mara said. When? 8 months. Maybe less if the review goes well. Nika thought about this. Will they come back? Mara considered the question honestly, the way you had to consider questions when they came from someone who would know if you were softening the truth. Probably. Not these ones. Different ones, maybe. These ones. After they've learned what they needed to learn. What did they need to learn? She looked at the water. The turtles were going out now. The big shapes submerging, one by one, finding depth, finding the magnetic coordinates that would carry them across the ocean to wherever they needed to go next season, and the season after, and the one after that. That we notice, Mara said. That we keep the record. You can't run a study on something that writes back. Nika looked at her for a moment. She picked up a stone from the tide line, smooth, white, the size of a fist, and held it in both hands with a certain deliberateness, the way she held things she was deciding to keep. My mother told me about the stone turtle, she said. This was the most Nika had said in 8 months about anything before her arrival on the island. And Mara kept very still, the way you kept still around something that might or might not choose to stay. Version, Mara asked. The one where he doesn't eat, Nika said. The one where he waits. I know that one, Mara said. She said it was the true one. Nika turned the stone over in her hands. She said the other ones were for people who didn't know how stories worked. True one is the one where knowing the warning is enough. They stood at the edge of the water in the gold and nameless light. The last of the leatherbacks had submerged. The Galvith station was dark and still in its way. Not absent, just waiting. The way things wait when they've been given something to process. The mainland was a line on the horizon that might have been cloud. Mara thought about the resets. All those mornings she'd woken into a day that had already happened, carrying the previous version with her, the double exposure of memory. She thought about what it had cost. The disorientation, the fear, the specific loneliness of being the only version of yourself that remembered all the versions. And she thought about what it had given her, which was 13 months of data she wasn't supposed to have, A report written in the Galveth's own notation. A conversation that had ended with a bell tone she didn't have a category for yet. She thought about the turtle that found the sacred pool and didn't eat, and waited, and saw what came out to find him. "Your mother was right," she said. Nika set the stone carefully at the edge of the tide, where the water came up to touch it, and receded, and came again. She watched it for a moment. The way you watch something you're leaving in a specific place, so you'll know it when you come back. "Can I learn the instruments?" she asked. "The monitoring ones, the ones you use to watch them." "Yes," Mara said. "Will you teach me the writing? The symbols you use in the notebooks? The Galveth notation system?" Nika nodded. "Yes," Mara said again. The child sat down in the sand, cross-legged, and pulled her knees to her chest and watched the dark water, with the particular patience of someone who has decided that waiting is not the same as doing nothing. It isn't. Mara had learned that in the clearest terms possible. Patience is data collection. Stillness is study. The one who keeps the record shapes the story, and the story shapes everything. Somewhere in the trees, a Brahmini kite called once, and the sound spread out across the water and went a long way before it was gone. The review in the end took 6 months and 2 weeks. Mara kept the record. She taught Nika the Galveth notation, and Nika learned it with the focused speed of someone who understands instinctively that language is a form of armament, that to speak in someone's notation is to enter their way of thinking, and to enter their way of thinking is to be able to say, clearly and in terms they cannot dismiss, "This is what you got wrong." They observed. They catalogued. The coherence anchor activated twice more, and both times Mara moved through the reset with her memory intact. The turtle shore thing, the magnetic position memory, she still didn't have a clean model for it, but she'd stopped needing one. Worked, and working was enough for now, and both times she wrote up the reset as a data point, dated it, filed it. She sent the reports to the Galveth station through the signal protocol she'd reverse engineered from the transmission fragments. She sent them in the correct notation, with the correct categorical headers, with the footnotes formatted in the style she'd identified as indicating priority research, the designation used for findings that required senior review. She received on the 63rd day after first contact a response, not language, a signal structure, a specific harmonic sequence that she'd never encountered in their transmissions. She spent 4 days analyzing it and arrived at the closest translation she could manage. Acknowledged. Source confirmed. Transmissions are being incorporated into the primary dataset. She was in the dataset. She printed the translation and pinned it above her monitoring station, next to the laminated map with its old name, Pulo Nu Penyu Batu, and below the photograph she'd taken of the 11 leatherbacks in the circle. Before she'd understood what it meant, back when it had still looked like a mystery instead of a methodology. Nika looked at the pinned translation for a long moment. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means we're not being studied anymore," Mara said. "It means we're colleagues." Nika considered this with the same flat, containing gaze. "Is that better?" "Slightly," Mara said. "It means they'll argue with us instead of erasing us. Arguing is harder. Arguing means they think we're worth answering." Nika nodded slowly, filing this. On the day the Galveth station's lights went dark, fully dark, the complete shutdown signature Mara had been watching for 2 months. It was late afternoon, the tide going out, the beach littered with the high-water detritus of ordinary existence. Nika was running the leatherback count, moving methodically along the tide line with the observation tablet, speaking the notation under her breath. Mara stood at the edge of the water and watched the Galveth station and the space where it had been, and the particular way the light moved in, now that the constant background hum of the coherence anchor had stopped. The silence was a different quality than the silence before, not empty, full. She thought about the stone turtle on the shore. She thought about all the versions. The one where he's ruined, the one where love undoes the ruin, the one where he never eats at all. She thought about standing at the edge of something and deciding very deliberately not to be consumed by it. Deciding that knowing the warning is enough. It is enough. It's more than enough. It's the specific human thing, the keeping of record, the building of model, the patient accumulation of morning after morning, reset after reset, all of it held in the body's magnetic memory, the way north is held, the way home is held. The turtles had been doing it for 40,000 years, finding the shore across every extinction, across the remapping of the world, and they had never had to think about it, never had to decide to be stubborn. Humans had to decide, they decided. Nika came up beside her with the tablet, the day's count entered in neat Galveth notation, the footnotes formatted correctly, the categorical headers precise. 12 nesting females, she said. 2 new arrivals, one is very large. I've logged her as specimen 14, she paused. I named her in the margin though, outside the formal notation. What did you name her? Nika looked at the water. The big leatherback was visible now, surfacing briefly in the shallows, her ancient carapace dark and massive against the amber light. A shape that had been the same shape for longer than the island had existed, longer than the stories told about it, longer than anything that needed to tell stories to remember who it was. Stone turtle, Nika said. Mara put her arm around the child's shoulders, and they stood at the edge of the tide, and the tide came in.